My name is Dwight Couch. I'm one of the original founding members of the Santa Maria Valley Railway Historical Museum. We started in 1999, basically a group of men that were interested in preserving this caboose. When we started acquiring equipment for our museum, this was the first piece of equipment we acquired. And then in time, we acquired the boxcar and eventually a locomotive. We had the benefactors, a couple of benefactors that allowed us to store our equipment on the siding, do the work while we were there on the siding and all like that, but no real place to display it. We were in the mall in different storefronts in the mall doing the museum, displaying what we were, who we were. We had model trains and all like that, but as far as the equipment, this equipment, of course, that wasn't practical. So as time evolved, the transit center was decided upon for the city, and eventually through a lot of negotiations with the Hancock family, they got a place to build this transit center here where we are now on Boone. Now, the interesting thing about that is this is all the right-of-way of the original Santa Maria Valley Railway. And in doing so, they built the transit center, and a couple of us got together and said, you know, this is where we really need to be because this is the original right-of-way of the railroad. Went to Park and Recreation Department, Mr. Alex Posada, went to him and pled our case to him about the history. He was very much history oriented, pled our case to him, and he said, let me think about this. And so he went over, got a blueprint, laid it out where the transit center was, and says to us, on the back side of the transit center is a piece of land 20 feet wide and 150 feet long. Would that suit your needs? And we said, thank you, thank you, thank you. So that became our permanent home. Now, for all intent and purposes, it is a park that belongs to the city of Santa Maria. The land is. We're just tenants, if you will. Now, they built the enclosure, and we came in and laid all the track, laid the ballast, and brought all our equipment from different storage places in here to set up our museum as it's currently configured right now. We felt very privileged to have this caboose and to restore it because after World War II, well, okay, the cabooses in those days, again, you're talking about 20s, 30s, and 40s. They were all wooden cabooses because that was the material of the time. Steel was coming in, but not in the volume that they could use it for. So when the end of World War II came along and there were a lot of steel manufacturers available compared to before World War II, the railroads went to the steel manufacturers and said, we really want to replace our wooden cabooses with steel cabooses because the wooden cabooses are basically fire hazards. They're still running steam locomotives which used charcoal or coal and oil and could catch wood on fire. So they said, all the railroads said, we want steel cabooses. So the industry came in and built all the steel cabooses, and then after that, the railroads had no more use for the wooden cabooses, so most of them got burned. Through some happenstance, this wooden caboose did not get burned, and we're very proud of it. We still have it, and we still are preserving it for what it used to be back in the 20s and 30s. It was a wooden caboose. Gentlemen, the railroad sold off the caboose because they had no need for it anymore. A scrap dealer, Milo Farino, bought the caboose and in process going to restore it because it was in bad shape. And then he fell ill, and where the car was stored was on Blosser. So when we would drive by that, we would see the caboose deteriorating in front of our eyes, and we said we would prefer to save it. So we contacted the owner and said, we'd like to buy the caboose and restore it. And he says, I'd like you to do that too. So we said, we don't have much money because we just incorporated. And he said, how about if I sell it to you for $1? And we were amazed. He says, I'll do that if you do the restoration that I'm no longer able to, because the ultimate goal is to preserve the caboose. So originally there were 8-10 of us working on the project, and we thought, well, it was in pretty bad shape. It'll take about a year. Well, that went to 4 years before we finally completed the project. So we had to re-roof part of it. We had to re-floor part of it. It had deteriorated. Again, it's a wooden caboose. And with that comes age and wear. Originally, the caboose was built in Rock Island, Illinois in 1935. In the day when it was here, it was to protect the back end of the train. That's what the cabooses were. A lot of cabooses were long haul, on long haul trains. So you had basically, if you will, nowadays an RV on the back of a train. You had a bed, you had cooking stoves, you had water that you took on from periodically to wash your hands and drink and stuff like that. But it was something that would go for maybe 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 days, either between crews or wherever the destination was. So that, yeah, a two-man crew basically, because the brakeman would go out and switch cars in and out, and the conductor was basically the boss. Everybody thinks that the locomotive engineer is the boss. No, the locomotive engineer gets on and gets off every 8 hours because that's the law. But the conductor is the boss of the train. He stays with the train until the destination is completed. That's called a cupola. They call that and so it's a second story or half-story window above the train. And when the brakeman, when the train was in motion, the brakeman would sit up there and look out to see what was coming towards us on the train. If it was, we were there in the back end, make sure that there was no misaligning. You could see all the way down the train between the locomotive and where he was, and watch the tracking of the cars and make sure that there wasn't any bad problems with the cars. And if he did, he'd contact the engineer and they could stop and take a look at it. And then also to make sure that nobody jumped on board as the train went through towns. In many cases, people would try to get a ride, if you will, and of course that was frowned on, and that was one of his jobs. In those days when it started, there was very limited communication. Now, during the daytime, you had signal flags. When they were stopped, they could do a signal flag, go forward, go back, stuff like that. Periodically, maybe in the early twilight, they used lanterns that you could swing back and forth and all like that. But the main emergency way of conducting with the locomotive is this has air brakes, Westinghouse air brakes through the entire train from the locomotive back here. And it has, in this caboose, there is a gauge, an air gauge, air pressure gauge. Okay. But it also has a way of bleeding that air pressure off. Okay. So if you needed to get a hold of the engineer and it was an emergency, you would bleed it off. He has an exact duplicate gauge in his locomotive. He would see the air pressure drop and knew that that was the signal to stop. Very basic, but it worked. Well, again, technology. We didn't have Wi-Fi. We didn't even have two-way radios in those days. Again, you're going back to the early 1900s, even the middle 1900s, 1930, 1940. This was again built in 1935. The locomotive. We have a locomotive. It's an 040. It's an industrial locomotive. So it has 4 wheels, drivers, what they call. Nothing in the front, nothing in the back Basically, it's to shuttle cars back and forth. And the original locomotive was built in 1884 in Rock Island, Illinois. And by a series of transitions, it came across the United States and was used in different locations throughout California. Part of it was used, Feather River Project, when they built that area up there, it was used for hauling gravel and things like that. It came down the coast and was used here for Betaravia, for sugar beets, shuttling in and out of the plant here. Okay. In Betaravia here. And that was okay until the sugar beet plant was sold and they had no more need for it. So in turn, the locomotive went down into LA, was used in a scrap yard down there for a while. Then in turn was sold to another company down in San Diego area. Got to San Diego, they used it in a facility down there, and again, it was pretty much at the end of its life as far as utilization. So when they decided that they no longer needed this company in San Diego, they in turn turned around and sold it to a railroad museum, Pacific Southwest Railway Museum in San Diego, as one of their exhibits. They in turn took it to their exhibit site and tried to decide how it would work as a stationary device, and it really didn't quite fit into their way of doing things at their museum. So they in turn sold it to, or donated, I guess, to the state of California. And up near Merced is a place called Railtown. And that went into their inventory for the state of California, was this locomotive. So again, when we had the opportunity to relocate where we are now, the thing we missed the most is motive power at the beginning of our exhibit. So we did some research and found out that locomotive was available to be bid on. And we bid on the locomotive and got the bid, and then so we bought the locomotive, transported it by flatbed truck all the way over here, craned it over the fence, and put it as our head-in locomotive for the exhibit. So it all worked out magnificently. It came back. We re-lettered it as the sugar company because it worked here. So it came back to one of the places that it worked at. Yes, for a while there was there's the part of the railroad goes right by the sugar company out there. If you see the big silos, the two silos out there in Betaravia, what they call Betaravia Junction, those silos were used to store the sugar after it was processed. Yeah, Black Road. But again, it just seemed fortuitous that it worked here for the sugar company, and then we had an opportunity to have it represent our museum back in the town that it worked at. So very fortuitous. He came from Los Angeles in 1935, had some friends up here, and decided to relocate. He lived in Los Angeles near the La Brea tar pits, and eventually through research and all, they found out there was oil underneath the land that he owned. And one thing his father taught him very early was, you never sell real estate. Money comes and money goes, but you do not sell real estate. So when they did discover, he borrowed money to research oil in this area. And the first 7 oil wells that they sunk were water. The 8th was oil. And from there, they started surrounding the area, and different oil companies came to him and bought the rights to drill and extract the wells, the oil underneath the property. And from that, he made quite a bit of money and was very well working in LA in different charitable organizations and places like that. When he was in Los Angeles, he was one of the original founders of the Automobile Club of Southern California. Also, he loved to play the cello, so he was instrumental in starting the Los Angeles Philharmonic. The Bank of California, he was vice president of the first Bank of California in Los Angeles also. Okay. In fact, you're absolutely right. His father's property, the center, part of the center, not the whole center, but part of the center of his father's property was the La Brea tar pits. And one of Alan's jobs, from what I was told, was he would put tar in a wagon and with the horses drive that tar down to downtown LA, which was about 10 miles, and they would use that to lay over the top of all the dirt and dust that was down there to keep the dust to a minimum. So that's basically some way that they actually used the tar pit to help the city itself. But yes, that was the original part of his father's property, was the La Brea tar pits. And again, as you mentioned, they used that name to put on all different kinds of things. Basically, La Brea is their trade name as far as what they want to do with it. He was a wide diversity person. He liked any kind of transportation. He got into nautical. He liked ships and became a ship captain, if you will. And then also he came up here and got involved with trains. And then after he did the trains and got him up and running, then he could see down the line, he saw aviation coming, and he was fascinated by aviation. So in the early 30s, he hired a couple pilots to come to town, and they started a school of aviation. So he would teach people want to learn how to fly. There was an airfield here. He'd come in and they would train with him, and they'd be a pilot when they finished the school of aviation. And then as time went by, the later 30s, then we could see World War II coming, and the Army Air Corps came and said, would you take on a contract to train more pilots? You're just training a few of them. Now we need quite a few. And they said, sure. And then when World War II broke out, they had a lot of pilots to be trained. And at that time, they moved the School of Aviation from where it is now, currently Hancock College, to where it's relocated into the west part of town. That's the new airport there. It basically was a training ground for pilots for World War II. They had something like 8,000 pilots, if I remember rightly. I'm not sure the figure, but 8,000 pilots were trained here, and they had a 6,000-foot runway, which is unusual for this size of a town, but they were also thinking about training bomber pilots. That's why they had a lengthy runway. Okay. When World War II broke out, they realized they had to train more pilots. They already had a program in place. It was just a matter of bringing more trainees and more instructors here, but they soon ran out of room at the Hancock field, if you will, at that time, and then built all the field that we have here now and made the transition probably in 41, 42. Yeah, well, that was called an airport spur, basically, and a lot of stuff was taken out there and offloaded so they could be right there at the airport, or at the field, I should say, Hancock Field right now. Exactly, and they're still using it today. Okanite, which is a big cable company, uses it. Hayward Lumber brings in lumber for building trusses and things like that. So there's still utilization, industrial utilization. A couple of frozen food companies freezes strawberries, so they ship out freezer cars of strawberries, frozen strawberries. So that's the commodities that they ship out of here. Again, Captain Hancock loved aviation, started the school of aviation here, and was really a big backer of Lindbergh when Lindbergh crossed the Atlantic. And after that, they had a couple of pilots who wanted to try to cross the Pacific. financed the plane that they had to cross the Pacific. It was called the Southern Cross. And again, he was very critical in getting that operation going. And again, he liked being a cellist, so when he came into Santa Maria, he's also set up the Santa Maria Symphony for all the people in town that wanted to have music in their. In those days, we have radio, but nothing else, like the cultural type of things. So again, he set up the Santa Maria Symphony for everybody that wanted to join that. So he was very instrumental in expanding the city, not only historically, but culturally also too. And again, eventually, the property that was part of his farm became Marion Hospital. He donated that property to Marion Hospital, and Marion Hospital is named after his wife. Rosemary Farms was also, he raised chickens for many, many years there at Rosemary Farms. That was, I think his daughter's name was Rosemary. One of the things that, again, when Captain Hancock came here, they had very little facilities for the equipment, the railroad equipment, because a lot of that was just held on a siding out in Orchid area, because the gentleman that owned the trains and all at that time was strictly used to, just using it and then trying to ship his oil out, which didn't work out. So Captain bought everything, all the rolling stock, all the locomotives and everything. But then, of course, being he was going to set up a railroad here in town for vegetables and all like that, he started building. And we have, near here, we have a big rectangular building. For lack of a better word, it's the roundhouse, but actually it's the engine house, if you will. So we had that there, and then leading out of there where the locomotives and all were stored. And further on down, there's a freight house on the right-of-way. And then past over on this side of the street, there were a lot of warehouses for storage and stuff like that. But it all started with the engine house. There was a turntable, if you will. It's been removed now. But all the facilities you needed for a train, for maintenance and everything else, was right there. And the interesting thing again about it is, go back to his father's say, you don't sell real estate, you don't sell real estate. Well, they're not using it right now, but it still belongs to the Hancock family. What the long-term goal, we don't know, but the property still is the Hancock property. So that's why it's still the engine house and the freight house are still part of that property. They're still here as part of history.
Yeah.
If you will. Yeah, definitely. And then, of course, on this side of Miller, where the transit center is now, and all the way out to where the Highway 101 is, that was all freight storage sheds all along there. And we probably had 1, 2, 3. I think there was four rail lines to transport stuff back and forth. The interesting thing was, when Captain Hancock originally took over this line, they were all steam locomotives. They had 3 steam locomotives that he bought when we bought the property. One of his goals in life was to have a locomotive that he owned himself. So he had a locomotive built, number 21, that was specifically built for him or for the railroad. The other ones were used and came with the property, but he had number 21 built specifically for the Santa Maria Valley Railroad. When he was in Los Angeles, he had an acquaintance with Walt Disney. Now, Walt Disney, I think most people know, loved trains. In fact, he started his career as what they call a butcher. He was selling newspapers on a train many, many years ago when he first started. So he had a love affair with trains. He has a riding train in his backyard. Carrollwood is the name of the property. And he built his own little railroad there. And of course, that was the impetus for the railroad around Disneyland now. And again, knowing Captain, and they both had a passion for the trains. So periodically Walt Disney would come up here, and he and the captain would take 21 out and ride around the property on the weekends just to have their own little toy trains. This railroad that was here, originally the owner of the railroad bought it because he had oil in the Orchid area of this town and was drilling and bringing in oil, but then had a difficult time transporting it to market because the oil cars were being restricted by other oil companies, and he didn't have the clout to do that. So he gave up and said that's all he really wanted to do was transport oil. It went, the eastern side of the railroad went all the way out to Parker and Cat Canyon area, and you know, there was not as much agriculture on the east side of the east side of town as there is now. And there was a gravel pit beside an oil refinery out there at the end of the line that they would transport the materials into the city and then export it from there. But originally, the whole idea before they got into that part of the rail line was there were 400 small vegetable farmers in the valley. Okay. And at that time, they had not developed the Salinas Valley properties nor the San Joaquin. This is 1935. And so they had a need to ship their vegetables to both LA and San Francisco because they were the only major vegetable farming in the area. So that was their problem, was to get the product shipped, and he redid the railroad and started shipping their product out of here. And in the process of doing that, in those days, they had no mechanical refrigeration. So the first thing he had to do when he bought the property and all was build a ice house. And that ice house produced 350-pound blocks of ice. And they would put a partition on both sides of a boxcar, and then fill the center part with produce, and that was the way they refrigerated it until it got to market. Periodically, every day or every 2 days, going north or going south, they could re-ice it. There were machines along the way that they could re-ice the boxcars. The ice house ran from 1925 until 1975, and that was no longer used at all. So then they tore it down, and there was just open spaces here. Santa Maria Valley is basically what they call in the railroad terms a short line. Anything under 50 miles long is considered a short line. Yeah, on the east side of town, back in the early 90s, that part of the area was no longer needed for commercial enterprises. They started doing a lot of farming out there. Mm-hmm. So basically, they weren't running equipment out there anymore, and they decided to cease with that part of the line. It wasn't financially feasible anymore. No, most of the vegetables coming out of here, which we still produce an awful lot, are all brought out by truck. They find it because of the dispersion, the distribution throughout the entire United States and going up into Canada, that it's more economical for them to go to the individual processors here in town and retrieve the vegetables by truck. We're open, yes, by all means. We're open two Saturdays a month, the second and fourth Saturday of the month, from noon until 4. And we'd love to tell you the history of trains and the history of the Santa Maria Valley also to go with it. Come on down and see the train.